Right now, Lake Powell holds less than 1/4 of its full capacity, while its surface sits only about 35 feet above the level where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower. That distance may sound reassuring. It is not. The reservoir is losing elevation during the season, when the shrinking snowmelt supply must compete with downstream releases, desert heat, and the demands of a river system serving tens of millions of people. The white bathtub ring surrounding the lake is no longer merely a record of water already lost. It is becoming a countdown marked directly onto the canyon walls. But that is not the most frightening part. The real threat is not simply that Lake Powell could store less water. It is that the remaining water could fall too low to move through the dam in the way the entire system expects. Below critical elevations, turbines stop working, pressure weakens, and a small set of lower outlet pipes must carry an increasingly important burden. The question is no longer only how much water remains. It is whether gravity can still deliver that water downstream when farms, cities, power systems, and ecosystems need it most. Viewers can like, subscribe, and leave their location in the comments, because the distance between this reservoir and their own lives may be far smaller than it appears. Along the sandstone walls of Lake Powell, the waterline is no longer difficult to find. It is written across the canyon as a pale band of exposed rock, a vast white ring separating the reservoir people remember from the reservoir that exists now. Below it, marinas sit farther from their original shorelines, launch ramps reach toward water they can barely touch, and crews extend temporary surfaces across ground that was once submerged. The lake remains open. Boats still move through its channels. Visitors still arrive beneath the desert sun. Yet every ordinary activity now takes place on top of an extraordinary engineering problem. The water is not simply low. It is approaching the elevations at which the machinery, pipes, power contracts, release schedules, and legal assumptions surrounding Glen Canyon Dam begin to work differently. Near Page, Arizona, National Park Service staff and marina operators have already been adapting to rapidly changing access conditions. Some ramps can function only with extensions. Some services must move with the shoreline. Boaters are warned that familiar routes may contain newly exposed rocks, narrowing channels, sandbars, and hazards that were hidden when the reservoir stood higher. These disruptions are visible, but they are not the central emergency. A closed ramp can be extended, a marina can sometimes be relocated, a navigation map can be updated. The deeper problem is taking shape inside the dam, far below the recreation areas, where the elevation of the water determines which passages remain usable and how much water can be sent downstream. Lake Powell recently stood near 3,524 feet above sea level, only a few dozen feet above the minimum level required for normal hydropower generation. The difference can look small on a map and enormous from the canyon floor, but for the dam, it is a narrowing mechanical margin. The Bureau of Reclamation has projected that the reservoir could finish the current water year near 3,516 feet, holding roughly 5 million acre-feet, or only about 22% of its full storage capacity. That forecast is not a certainty. Snowfall, runoff, releases, conservation actions, and weather can move the outcome in either direction. But it places the reservoir in a region where every foot matters more than it did when the lake was high. The people watching those feet are not only tourists or residents of Page. They include dam operators studying intake conditions, power managers calculating replacement electricity, hydrologists updating runoff forecasts, tribal governments defending water and cultural resources, farmers planning irrigation, river guides watching flows through the Grand Canyon, and officials across 7 states trying to prevent one shortage from becoming several connected shortages. The Colorado River serves about 40 million people in the United States and Mexico and supports agriculture across some of the driest productive land in North America. Not every household receives water directly from Lake Powell, and not every city would lose water the moment the reservoir crossed a critical elevation. The system is more complicated than that. Lake Powell stores water from the upper basin and regulates releases toward Lake Mead. Glen Canyon Dam also produces electricity. shapes downstream river flows, supports environmental programs, and helps the United States meet delivery commitments under a web of laws, agreements, court decisions, and treaties often called the law of the river. That means a problem at the dam can travel outward through several systems before it reaches a kitchen faucet, an irrigation canal, a power bill, or a public budget. The warning now coming from federal water managers is unusually direct. Under extremely low runoff conditions, Lake Powell could approach or fall below the minimum power pool elevation of 3,490 feet. Below that level, the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam could no longer generate hydropower in the normal way, and the ability to release water would become more constrained. Earlier projections even showed that threshold becoming possible within the current operating horizon without substantial intervention, although updated scenarios can shift as conditions change. The important point is not that one forecast has predicted one exact date. The important point is that a condition once treated as remote has entered official planning. Government agencies are no longer discussing only how to manage a drought while preserving ordinary dam operations. They are preparing for the possibility that ordinary operations themselves may no longer be available. Inside Glen Canyon Dam, 8 generating units normally allow water to move from the reservoir through massive penstocks, spin turbines, produce electricity, and continue downstream. That process converts the elevation of stored water into both river flow and power. As the reservoir falls, the pressure created by the water column declines. The turbines lose generating capacity before they become completely unusable. If the surface reaches minimum power pool, hydropower production stops. But the downstream river does not simply stop at that moment. Water can still be released through 4 lower river outlet works, sometimes described as bypass tubes. These passages sit deeper in the dam and were built to move water without sending it through the turbines. Their existence is essential, but dependence on them changes the character of the risk. 4 lower outlets would be asked to carry responsibilities normally shared with 8 large power penstocks. Their condition, capacity, hydraulic behavior, maintenance requirements, and ability to operate under lower reservoir pressures would become central to the security of downstream releases. This is why the people most immediately affected are difficult to see from the shoreline. A technician inside the dam may notice the problem through vibration readings or flow limitations. A power agency may encounter it as a sharp reduction in inexpensive, flexible hydropower. Utilities receiving Colorado River Storage Project electricity may need to replace lost generation with power purchased elsewhere, potentially at higher cost. And during periods when the western grid is already strained by extreme heat, the loss of Glen Canyon generation would not black out the entire West by itself. The regional grid has many sources of electricity, but hydropower has a particular value because operators can adjust output quickly as demand rises and falls. Losing that flexibility is more serious than simply subtracting one power plant's annual energy from a spreadsheet. It removes a tool used to balance a grid increasingly exposed to heat waves, wildfire threats, transmission constraints, and rapidly changing solar production. Downstream, a different set of people watches the volume and timing of releases. River ecosystems below Glen Canyon Dam have been reshaped by decades of controlled flow and altered water temperatures. Fish, insects, sandbars, riparian vegetation, and recreational users all respond to how much water is released and when. Managers sometimes adjust flows to protect beaches, support native species, or interfere with invasive fish. Lower reservoir levels can change the temperature of water entering the dam and limit the operational choices available for those experiments. The problem therefore moves from reservoir elevation into turbine intakes, from turbine intakes into river temperature, from river temperature into fish habitat, and from fish habitat into the ecological management of the Grand Canyon. Farther away, farmers and cities are affected through the relationship between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Powell is not an isolated container. It is the upper major reservoir in a linked system. Water released from Glen Canyon Dam flows toward Lake Mead, where it supports lower basin deliveries to Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico. When Powell falls, managers face competing pressures: preserve enough elevation to protect operations at Glen Canyon, release enough water to meet downstream requirements, and avoid worsening conditions at Meade. Water retained in one reservoir cannot simultaneously raise the other. Water released to protect one obligation may reduce the buffer protecting another. Every decision moves risk through the system. Tribal nations experience this crisis through an even deeper contradiction. Many tribes hold senior water rights or unresolved claims, yet some communities still lack reliable household water infrastructure. The river may pass through or beside their lands, while families depend on hauled water, aging systems, or incomplete projects. At the same time, changes in reservoir operations can affect sacred places, archaeological sites, fisheries, recreation economies, and cultural relationships with the river. A falling reservoir can expose sites that were inundated, but it can also accelerate erosion, looting, and damage. The crisis, therefore, cannot be described only as a contest among large cities and agricultural districts. It is also a test of whose water security receives protection when the system loses room to maneuver. The severity of the situation does not come from one dramatic moment when the lake suddenly becomes empty. It comes from the gradual disappearance of choices. At a high elevation, operators can route water through turbines, generate substantial power, shape releases, absorb poor runoff years, and coordinate with Lake Meade from a position of storage. At a lower elevation, each of those options narrows. The reservoir still contains water, but less of it can perform all the functions assigned to it. That distinction is why viewers far from Utah and Arizona should care. Modern infrastructure often fails function by function before it fails visibly. A hospital can remain standing while losing staff, cooling, or backup power. A city can still receive rain while its drainage network is overwhelmed. A reservoir can still hold trillions of gallons while losing the hydraulic height needed to move that water through the system efficiently. Lake Powell is now exposing that hidden stage of failure. The immediate scene is a shrinking shoreline. The larger scene stretches from a control room inside Glen Canyon Dam to electrical customers across the west. From a river guide below Lee's Ferry to an irrigated field hundreds of miles downstream, and from a tribal household without secure running water to negotiators deciding how the Colorado River will be governed after the current rules expire. The official warning is not that every one of these systems will collapse at once. It is that the margin separating normal management from emergency management has become dangerously thin. The lake is still there. The dam is still operating. Water is still moving downstream, but beneath that appearance of continuity, the system is being pushed toward a narrower set of pipes, a smaller reserve of elevation, and decisions in which protecting one function may require sacrificing another. What is happening at Lake Powell is therefore not a distant spectacle of drought. It is the beginning of a transfer. Risk is moving from the exposed canyon walls into the machinery of the dam, from the machinery into the power grid and river, and from those systems into the lives of people who may never see the white ring for themselves. The number most people hear about Lake Powell is the percentage, roughly 1/5 full. It is clean, dramatic, and easy to repeat, but that number hides almost everything that matters. Lake Powell was built to hold approximately 25 million acre-feet of water at full capacity. An acre-foot is the amount required to cover 1 acre of land with water 1 foot deep, equal to about 326,000 gallons. Multiply that by 25 million, and the full reservoir represents more than 8 trillion gallons. It is a volume so large that ordinary comparisons begin to fail. It could supply millions of households for years, fill an unimaginable procession of backyard swimming pools, or spread a sheet of water across entire states. Yet when the reservoir holds about 5 million acre-feet, as current federal projections indicate near the end of the water year, the important fact is not merely that roughly 20 million acre-feet are missing from full storage. The important fact is where the remaining 5 million sits inside the shape of the canyon. A reservoir does not lose usable capacity in a simple, linear way. Lake Powell is not a vertical tank with straight walls. It is a drowned network of canyons, tributaries, shelves, cliffs, and narrowing channels. Near the top, a small change in elevation can spread across an enormous surface area. Near the bottom, the water occupies a smaller and more confined space. That means a foot of elevation near full pool can represent a very different volume from a foot close to the dam's lowest operating range. It also means that saying the lake is 22% full does not mean operators retain 22% of every function the reservoir once provided. Storage percentage, release capacity, power production, shoreline access, water temperature, and operational flexibility do not decline at the same rate. They peel away in layers. To understand the headline number, the first landmark is 3,700 feet above sea level. That is the normal full pool elevation of Lake Powell. At that height, the reservoir extends deep into side canyons and stores close to its designed maximum. The second landmark is 3,525 feet, the target elevation federal managers have used as a protective buffer. It sits 35 feet above minimum power pool and provides room for action before the lake reaches a more dangerous operating zone. The third landmark is 3,490 feet. That is minimum power pool, the elevation below which water can no longer pass through the power plant in the normal way, and Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower. The fourth landmark is approximately 3,370 feet, commonly called dead pool. At that level, gravity can no longer move water through the lowest conventional outlet passages in a dependable way. The name sounds final, but it does not mean every drop has vanished. It means the reservoir has lost the elevation needed to release water through the dam's existing gravity-fed system. Water could still remain trapped upstream, visible from above and measurable in billions of gallons, while becoming extraordinarily difficult to deliver downstream. Between full pool and minimum power pool lies a vertical distance of about 210 feet. Between minimum power pool and dead pool lies another 120 feet. Those numbers appear to describe a long descent, but the reservoir has already traveled most of the distance from full pool to the power threshold. That is what makes the remaining margin so unsettling. When Lake Powell stands near 3,516 feet, it is approximately 184 feet below full pool, but only about 26 feet above minimum power pool. In other words, measured vertically, the reservoir has already crossed roughly 7/8 of the distance between a full lake and the loss of normal hydropower production. The remaining distance is less than the height of many three-story buildings. It is roughly the length of a large city bus standing upright. On the scale of the canyon, 26 feet looks small. On the scale of dam operations, it is the narrowing space between a system functioning as designed and a system forced onto its backup pathways. Even the projected inflow carries a headline that is difficult to absorb. Federal forecasts place unregulated inflow into Lake Powell for the current water year near 3.5 million acre-feet, roughly 36% of the modern historical average. Unregulated inflow is an estimate of the water that would enter the reservoir without the effects of upstream reservoir operations. It allows hydrologists to compare the underlying water supply from year to year. 3.5 million acre-feet is still more than 1 trillion gallons. It sounds enormous because it is enormous, but the Colorado River system was built around enormous demands, enormous evaporation losses, enormous legal commitments, and reservoirs designed to carry water across dry years. 1 trillion gallons entering the lake can still represent a severe deficit when the long-term average is nearly 3 times larger and downstream releases continue at millions of acre-feet per year. This is the paradox at the center of Lake Powell. Numbers that would overwhelm a city can still be insufficient for a continental-scale water system. An annual release of 6 million acre-feet, for example, equals nearly 2 trillion gallons moving through Glen Canyon Dam. That release does not occur because operators are casually draining a lake. It is part of the mechanism that links the upper and lower Colorado River basins, supplies Lake Mead, fulfills legal requirements, supports downstream water users, and maintains river flows. But when inflow is substantially smaller than required releases and other losses, the arithmetic has only one direction: the reservoir falls. Snow can temporarily reverse the decline. A wet year can lift the surface dramatically. Conservation and operational changes can slow the descent. Yet, unless incoming water consistently matches or exceeds outgoing water, every acre-foot released must come from storage accumulated in the past. Lake Powell then becomes less like a lake receiving a river and more like a savings account being used to cover a recurring gap between income and expenses. The account still contains billions of dollars, metaphorically speaking, but the annual withdrawals remain larger than the deposits. The largest number is therefore not simply the amount missing from the reservoir. It is the accumulated imbalance that produced the missing water. Since the beginning of this century, the Colorado River Basin has experienced a prolonged period of unusually dry conditions, intensified by rising temperatures. Hotter air increases evaporation from reservoirs and landscapes. Hotter soil draws more moisture from melting snow before that water can reach streams. Plants release more water into the atmosphere. A snowpack that appears near average on a mountain may therefore produce below-average runoff at the reservoir. This breaks an assumption embedded in decades of water planning, that a given amount of snow will reliably become a familiar amount of river flow. The conversion rate has changed. The snow does not need to disappear completely for the river to shrink. It only needs to lose more water on the journey from mountain to channel. That hidden loss helps explain why a reservoir can gain water after a strong winter and still remain far below its historical storage. One good season can produce a visible rise, reopen ramps, cover exposed rocks, and create a public sense that the emergency has ended. But a rise of 50 feet does not restore the hundreds of vertical feet already lost. And it does not erase the structural imbalance between long-term supply and use. The bathtub ring remains above the water, like a previous high water mark on a financial chart. It records not one bad year, but the cumulative withdrawal of a reserve built over decades. The comparison becomes even clearer when the volume is translated into human use. 1 million acre-feet contains about 326 billion gallons. Depending on climate, conservation, landscaping, and accounting methods, that amount can support several million households for a year. Lake Powell's projected 5 million acre-feet is therefore not a small puddle nearing disappearance. It is a colossal body of stored water. That is precisely why the danger is easy to misunderstand. People expect a water crisis to look like an empty basin, cracked mud, abandoned boats, and a dry riverbed. But infrastructure can cross critical thresholds long before the visual supply reaches zero. The dam does not ask only whether water exists. It asks whether that water is high enough above an intake to create pressure, whether the intake remains submerged, whether turbines can operate safely, whether outlet valves can handle the required flow, and whether the release can be sustained during months of declining elevation. The difference between 5 million acre-feet and zero is vast in volume, but much smaller in function than intuition suggests. Below minimum power pool, the reservoir does not lose every release capability, but it loses the power plant as a pathway. 8 turbine penstocks that normally move water and generate electricity become unavailable for their primary purpose. The burden shifts toward 4 river outlet works with a combined design capacity of approximately 15,000 cubic feet per second under favorable conditions. 1 cubic foot per second equals about 7.5 gallons, passing a point every second. 15,000 cubic feet per second is more than 112,000 gallons each second, a torrent by any ordinary measure. Yet even that impressive figure is not fixed. Outlet capacity depends on reservoir elevation, because lower water produces lower pressure. As the lake falls, the same pipes can deliver less water. The headline capacity printed in an engineering description is therefore not a guarantee available at every elevation. Gravity writes a declining limit into the system. This is why the phrase 22% full can be both accurate and misleading. It describes storage as a fraction of total capacity, but it does not describe distance to critical infrastructure. It does not explain that the surface may stand only a few dozen feet above minimum power pool. It does not reveal that hydropower generation weakens as hydraulic head declines. It does not show that backup outlets lose discharge capacity as the reservoir approaches dead pool. It does not tell a farmer how much water can move through the dam during a critical month, or a grid operator how much flexible power will remain available during an extreme heat event. A percentage compresses the reservoir into one dimension. The actual threat exists in three dimensions: volume, elevation, and time. Volume determines how much water remains. Elevation determines which systems can reach it. Time determines whether managers can act before the next threshold arrives. The most alarming number may therefore be neither 5 million acre-feet nor 22%. It may be 26 feet. That narrow vertical margin is now carrying the weight of turbines, power contracts, downstream releases, environmental programs, and emergency planning. It is not yet a declaration that failure is inevitable. Forecasts can improve, operations can change, water can be conserved or moved strategically. But the number reveals how far the reservoir has already traveled from abundance toward constraint. Lake Powell still holds a trillion-gallon scale reserve. The deeper truth is that a reservoir can remain vast, while its operating world becomes very small. The water has not yet disappeared. The margin has. The most obvious way to measure a reservoir crisis is to ask how much water remains. That is also the easiest way to misunderstand what is happening at Lake Powell. 5 million acre-feet still sounds like an immense reserve. A surface stretching through red rock canyons still looks like a lake. Water continues to pass through Glen Canyon Dam. Electricity continues to be generated, and the Colorado River continues toward the Grand Canyon. From a distance, the system appears diminished but intact. Yet the critical variable is not volume alone, it is elevation. More precisely, it is the vertical distance between the surface of the reservoir and the openings through which the water must travel. That distance creates hydraulic head, the pressure supplied by gravity. It is the invisible force that allows the stored water to descend through the dam, accelerate through the penstocks, turn the turbines, and emerge downstream. As the lake falls, that force weakens, even while an enormous volume remains behind the concrete. The overlooked threat is therefore not that the reservoir suddenly becomes empty. It is that the reservoir can lose function while it still contains water. Lake Powell is often imagined as a giant bucket. In that picture, the remaining water can always be poured out until the bucket is dry. Glen Canyon Dam does not work that way. It has fixed openings installed at fixed elevations. The water cannot decide to find a lower route simply because the surface has fallen. It can move only through the passages engineers placed inside the structure, and each passage depends on water standing high enough above it. The entire system is built around an assumption so ordinary that it is almost invisible. The reservoir will remain tall enough for gravity to do the work. When Lake Powell is high, hundreds of feet of water press toward the power intakes. Gravity converts that height into pressure and velocity. Water enters 8 large penstocks, rushes downward through the dam, spins 8 turbines, and continues into the river. The dam does not need pumps to force the main releases downstream. The mountain snowpack has already lifted the water. The river has carried it to the reservoir. The canyon has stored it above the outlet. Gravity completes the delivery, but every foot lost from the surface removes part of that stored energy. The water becomes lower, the pressure at the intakes declines, and the generating system produces less power from the same quantity of flow. This weakening begins before the lake reaches minimum power pool. There is no single switch that transforms a perfectly functioning power plant into a silent one. The deterioration is progressive. Generating efficiency falls. The operating range narrows. Operators have fewer combinations of turbines and flows available to them. Equipment must function under conditions farther from those that shaped its original design. The headline threshold of 3,490 feet matters because normal hydropower generation becomes unavailable below it, but the consequences of approaching that elevation begin higher. A system can become fragile before it becomes inoperable. That is the first hidden layer. The second appears after the turbines are lost. Water could still pass through 4 river outlet works positioned lower in the dam. These steel-lined pipes are enormous by human standards, each approximately 8 feet in diameter, and together they can release a powerful artificial river. Their presence prevents minimum power pool from immediately becoming dead pool, but calling them backup outlets can create another dangerous misunderstanding. A backup system is often imagined as a duplicate of the primary system, waiting to provide the same service when the main equipment fails. The river outlet works are not a complete duplicate of the power plant. They do not generate electricity. They offer fewer pathways. Their discharge capacity changes with reservoir elevation. They have different hydraulic behavior, different maintenance requirements, and a history that demonstrates why sustained dependence on them must be treated cautiously. At high reservoir levels, the combined outlet works can move roughly 15,000 cubic feet of water every second. That figure sounds definitive. It is not. It describes capacity under favorable hydraulic conditions, not a permanent guarantee. As the water surface descends, pressure declines. With less pressure pushing water through the pipes, their maximum discharge falls. The reservoir is therefore approaching a system in which the number of available release routes can shrink from 12 major pathways, 8 power penstocks, and 4 lower outlets, to only 4, while the ability of those remaining 4 to carry water also weakens with every additional loss of elevation. The crisis is not only less water, it is less water trying to pass through fewer openings with less force behind it. The image is not a bucket being emptied, it is a water tower, slowly sinking toward the height of the neighborhood it serves. Water may remain in the tank, but the pressure in the pipes fades. Faucets at lower elevations may continue to run. Those on higher ground may weaken first. Engineers may open valves farther. Operators may alter schedules. But once the tank approaches the same height as the outlets, stored volume alone can no longer guarantee delivery. Lake Powell is that water tower on a continental scale, and the Colorado River below Glen Canyon Dam is one of the pipes dependent on its height. The vulnerability becomes sharper because the lower outlets are not merely passive holes in concrete. Water moving at high speed through a pipe can create zones of sharply reduced pressure. If local pressure drops far enough, vapor bubbles form inside the flow. When those bubbles collapse against a metal surface, they release tiny but violent impacts. This process is called cavitation. A single collapsing bubble is microscopic. Millions of them, striking repeatedly, can pit steel, damage coatings, and erode protective surfaces. Glen Canyon Dam has faced cavitation before, most dramatically in its spillways during the high water crisis of the early 1980s. The river outlet works are different structures, but the physical warning is the same. Moving water can damage the very passage built to control it when velocity, pressure, surface condition, and operating duration combine in the wrong way. Federal inspections found new, minor cavitation damage after the river outlet works were used during a high-flow experiment under low reservoir conditions. The finding did not mean the pipes were about to fail. It meant the risk was physical, observable, and important enough to require new operating guidance, analysis, and the relining of the outlets. That distinction matters. The scientifically responsible conclusion is not that Glen Canyon Dam is on the verge of collapse. There is no basis for turning outlet wear into a prediction of catastrophic dam failure. The real warning is narrower and, in some ways, more consequential. The system may become increasingly dependent on equipment whose performance at very low elevations carries uncertainty, whose capacity declines with hydraulic head, and whose protective lining must withstand sustained releases. A failure does not need to split the dam to create a crisis. One outlet being restricted for inspection, repair, vibration, cavitation, or valve trouble could remove 1/4 of the remaining principal release pathways after the turbines become unavailable. 2 outlets out of service would cut the number in half. Maintenance that is routine when several alternative routes exist becomes strategically dangerous when only 4 remain. The weak point is not the full 700-foot wall of concrete. It may be a damaged section of steel lining, a valve that cannot be operated as expected, an air slot that does not control pressure correctly, or a release limit imposed to protect a pipe from further erosion. This is how large systems become vulnerable through small components. The dam can remain standing, the reservoir can remain visibly full of water, yet the controlled movement of that water can depend on a handful of mechanical passages buried inside the structure. Elevation also governs more than release capacity. It changes the temperature and quality of the water reaching the intakes. As the reservoir shrinks and its layers reorganize, warmer water can enter the dam, carrying ecological consequences downstream. It affects how much power each unit can produce, and how flexibly operators can respond to changes in electrical demand. It influences whether releases can be shaped for environmental goals without placing excessive stress on the remaining equipment. Every lost foot reaches into several systems at once because height is doing several jobs at once. It stores potential energy. It creates pressure. It keeps intakes submerged. It preserves multiple release routes. It supports power generation. It provides time for managers to react to the next dry forecast. This is why the 35-foot protective buffer above minimum power pool was never simply a convenient target on a chart. It represented operating space. It was a margin designed to reduce the risk of crossing into conditions with fewer known options. But a buffer is not a wall. It can be consumed by a weak runoff year, by required releases, by evaporation, and by the delay between recognizing a shortage and changing the demands placed upon the river. Once that buffer narrows, decision makers are no longer managing only water. They are managing altitude. They may conserve an acre-foot and still need to ask where that acre-foot sits relative to the intakes. They may negotiate a release volume and still need to ask whether the dam can physically deliver it at the required rate months later. The legal system measures water in acre-feet. The dam ultimately responds to feet of elevation and pounds of pressure. That mismatch is the overlooked center of the story. Laws can assign water that exists on paper. Reservoir accounting can show millions of acre-feet in storage. Agreements can specify how much should move from the upper basin toward the lower basin. But none of those documents can command water to flow through an opening once gravity no longer provides enough head. Nature does not recognize a water right as hydraulic pressure. A compact cannot spin a turbine. A forecast cannot widen a pipe. The closer Lake Powell moves toward its lower operating range, the more the physical geometry of Glen Canyon Dam begins to overrule the abstractions built around it. This is the reversal that changes the meaning of the entire crisis. The threat is not primarily an empty lake waiting somewhere in the future. It is a functioning system losing one capability at a time in the present. First, power output declines. Then, operating flexibility contracts. Then, the turbines become unavailable. Then 4 lower outlets inherit the burden. Then their capacity weakens as the reservoir falls farther. Finally, near dead pool, gravity can no longer move excess water through the existing outlets in the way the river system requires. At every stage, water can remain behind the dam. The visible resource survives longer than the infrastructure's ability to use it. Lake Powell is not merely running out of storage. It is descending through the architecture built to control it, passing one fixed opening after another. What is approaching Glen Canyon Dam is not just a lower number on a gauge. It is the moment when water, law, machinery, and gravity stop describing the same amount of available supply. To understand why gravity flow is the real threat at Lake Powell, the water must be followed from the moment it falls on the mountains to the moment it leaves Glen Canyon Dam, because the danger is not located in one place. It is a chain, and each link depends on the one before it. Snow accumulates across the high country of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. When spring warmth arrives, that snow begins to melt. Some of the water runs directly into creeks. Some enters the soil. Some is taken up by vegetation. Some evaporates before reaching a channel. What survives gathers into tributaries, enters the Colorado River system, and eventually moves toward Lake Powell. By the time it reaches the reservoir, Gravity has already carried it thousands of vertical feet downward. Glen Canyon Dam captures part of that descent and stores it as potential energy. The easiest way to picture potential energy is to imagine two identical buckets of water, one resting on the ground and one placed on the roof of a building. They contain the same volume, but the higher bucket can send water downward with greater force. Its height represents stored energy. Lake Powell is the higher bucket, except its scale is measured in canyons rather than stories. The reservoir does not merely store water, it stores water above the river below. That vertical separation is called hydraulic head, and it is the central mechanism in this story. Hydraulic head is the energy created by the difference between the water surface upstream and the water level downstream, adjusted for pressure and motion inside the system. In simple terms, the higher the reservoir stands above the outlet, the harder gravity can push. When the reservoir is full, the surface sits hundreds of feet above the power plant intakes and the river below. Water near the intake is under enormous pressure because it carries the weight of the water column above it. Once gates allow it to enter, that pressure accelerates the water through huge steel passages called penstocks. The penstocks direct the flow toward turbines near the base of the dam. Each turbine contains blades shaped to extract energy from moving water. As the water turns those blades, the turbine rotates a shaft connected to a generator. The generator converts mechanical rotation into electricity. The water then exits through draft tubes and returns to the Colorado River. In a matter of seconds, one parcel of mountain snowmelt becomes reservoir storage. Hydraulic pressure, mechanical rotation, electrical power, and downstream flow. The process appears effortless because gravity supplies the force. But gravity is not a machine that can be switched on at any elevation. It can only use the height available to it. As Lake Powell falls, the vertical distance between the surface and the downstream river becomes smaller. The weight pressing on the intakes declines. Water enters the penstocks with less pressure. The turbines receive less energy from each unit of flow. Engineers can compensate within limits by adjusting turbine gates, changing which generating units operate, and modifying the amount of water moving through them. But those adjustments cannot recreate lost elevation. A lower reservoir means less power can be extracted from the same gallon of water. This is why hydropower output declines before the official minimum power pool threshold is crossed. The turbines may still turn, but the system becomes less productive and less flexible. Imagine a bicycle descending a hill. Near the top, gravity accelerates it quickly. As the slope flattens, the bicycle still moves, but less energy is available. Glen Canyon Dam experiences a similar loss, except the slope is represented by water elevation and pressure rather than pavement. At normal full pool, the 8 generating units together can produce more than 1,000 megawatts under favorable conditions. At lower elevations, the same equipment cannot reach that output because the water arrives with less head. When the reservoir approaches 3,490 feet, the power plant reaches the lower boundary of normal operation. Below that elevation, water can no longer be sent through the turbine system in the manner required for hydropower generation. The river still needs water. Downstream obligations still exist. Lake Mead still depends on releases. The Grand Canyon does not pause because the turbines stop. That is when the second pathway becomes critical. 4 river outlet works pass through the lower portion of Glen Canyon Dam. Each consists of a pipe approximately 96 inches in diameter, controlled by large gates and hollow jet valves. Unlike the penstocks, these outlets bypass the turbines. Water released through them produces no electricity. It simply moves from the reservoir, through the dam, and into the river. Under high enough reservoir conditions, the 4 outlets have a combined capacity of approximately 15,000 cubic feet per second. That is more than 100,000 gallons passing through the system every second. It is enough flow to appear overwhelming to anyone standing downstream. But capacity is not a number permanently attached to a pipe. It is the result of pipe diameter, valve position, friction, pressure, and hydraulic head. The pipe does not pull water from the reservoir. Gravity pushes water into it, When the surface falls, that push weakens. The outlet may remain fully open and physically undamaged, yet carry less water because less energy is available to drive the flow. This is the hidden meaning of gravity flow. The system does not fail, only when an opening emerges above the water. It loses performance continuously as the water column above that opening becomes shorter. The relationship is not perfectly linear. Flow velocity through an outlet is related to the square root of the available head, which means reducing the height does not reduce flow in a simple one-for-one proportion. But the practical result is clear. Lower reservoir elevation produces lower maximum discharge. At the same time, the river outlet works may be asked to operate more often and for longer periods. That combination matters. A backup route facing less pressure might sound safer because the water is pushing with less force. Yet hydraulic systems are shaped by local conditions, not just total pressure. As high-speed water passes through gates, valves, bends, joints, or irregular surfaces, its local pressure can fall sharply. If that local pressure drops below the vapor pressure of water, tiny vapor cavities form. These are not bubbles of air leaking into the pipe. They are pockets where liquid water briefly changes into vapor because the pressure has become too low. When the surrounding pressure rises again, the cavities collapse. Their collapse can release intense microscopic impacts against nearby metal. This process is cavitation. It can sound like gravel moving through a pipe. It can create vibration. Over time, it can pit steel, strip protective coatings, enlarge surface defects, and damage the outlet lining. A useful image is rain striking stone, except each droplet is replaced by a collapsing cavity that concentrates its force onto an area smaller than a fingernail. One impact means almost nothing. Millions occurring repeatedly in the same region can remove material. Cavitation is not theoretical at Glen Canyon. Inspections have identified minor damage associated with river outlet work operations, prompting monitoring, revised operating considerations, and a federal project to reline all 4 outlets. The relining does not prove that catastrophic failure is approaching. It proves something more precise. The outlets are critical infrastructure, their surfaces matter, and their reliability under changing operating conditions must be protected before dependence on them increases. The Bureau of Reclamation began a project supported by an $8.9 million investment to renew the liners and preserve dependable releases. That work reveals how the mechanism travels from physics into policy. A vapor cavity forms because of a local pressure change. Repeated collapse damages a steel surface. Damage creates a maintenance requirement. Maintenance may take an outlet out of service. Losing one outlet reduces the number of available release pathways. Reduced capacity limits how managers can schedule downstream water. The schedule then reaches people. A turbine operator sees the mechanism as declining megawatts. A river manager sees it as fewer cubic feet per second available during a required release. A utility sees it as electricity that must be purchased from another source. A fish biologist sees it as a narrower ability to shape flows or water temperatures. A farmer may experience it later as another reason reservoir releases must be renegotiated. A household may never hear the term hydraulic head, but it can encounter the consequences through rates, restrictions, or public budgets. The mechanism begins with altitude and ends inside daily life. The city of Page and the Luchi chapter of the Navajo Nation provide an especially direct example. Their water supply depends on infrastructure connected to Lake Powell. As the reservoir fell, the original intake system faced declining access to usable water, forcing the construction of a lower intake connection designed to continue deliveries near dead pool conditions. The response demonstrates that water can remain physically present, yet become inaccessible to infrastructure positioned too high. Engineers had to reach lower because the water moved below the architecture built for the old reservoir. That same principle applies to the dam at a much larger scale. Every intake, penstock, gate, and outlet exists at a fixed elevation. Climate and river flow can move the reservoir. Concrete cannot follow it. Near dead pool, Around 3,370 feet, the distinction becomes severe. At that elevation, the reservoir may still contain water, and new inflow may still arrive from upstream. But the existing gravity-fed outlets lose the ability to pass stored water beyond what is entering and pushing through the system. The lake becomes less like a reservoir that can be drawn down, and more like a basin, with water trapped below the useful release level. To move that trapped storage downstream would require a different pathway, potentially involving new tunnels, lower outlets, pumping, or major structural modifications. Pumps could theoretically move water against a missing elevation advantage, but pumping volumes measured in millions of acre-feet would demand enormous infrastructure and energy. The system was built to exploit gravity, precisely because gravity is free, constant, and capable of moving colossal flows. Replacing it is not like installing a household pump in a basement. It would mean rebuilding the delivery logic of one of the largest water systems in North America. This is why the central threat is not a sudden mechanical drama. It is a gradual inversion. For decades, the reservoir's height made water management possible. That height generated power, supported releases, absorbed variations in runoff, and gave operators choices. As the surface descends, the same reservoir begins demanding more intervention, while providing less energy to perform the work. More monitoring is required. More restrictions may be needed. More equipment must be protected. More legal compromises become unavoidable. Yet the physical force available to move the water continues to decline. The Colorado River first enters the system as snow lifted by the atmosphere onto mountains. Gravity brings it down. Glen Canyon Dam pauses that descent and turns height into control. But once the stored water falls too close to the outlets, control begins to disappear. The threat is not that gravity suddenly stops existing. It is that the system runs out of height for gravity to use. The story of Lake Powell has happened before, but never in exactly the same way. History does not repeat itself like a recording. It repeats itself like a river, following the same valley, while carving a slightly different path each time. That is why the reservoir cannot be understood by looking only at today's water level. The present is standing on top of decades of engineering decisions, climate records, operational experiments, and moments when the Colorado River forced its managers to confront limits they had hoped never to reach. The first lesson comes from the opposite extreme. In the early 1980s, Glen Canyon Dam was not threatened by too little water. It was threatened by too much. An extraordinary combination of deep mountain snowpack, cool spring weather, and rapid warming produced runoff far beyond what managers expected. Lake Powell climbed relentlessly toward full capacity. Every additional foot increased pressure on the reservoir, leaving operators with fewer choices. Holding the water risked overtopping the dam, one of the most dangerous situations any reservoir can face. Releasing the water created another danger, because the spillways had rarely been used under such extreme conditions. Eventually, managers opened the spillway gates and allowed enormous volumes of water to roar through tunnels carved into the canyon walls. At first, everything appeared to function as designed. Then something hidden began happening inside the concrete. As water accelerated through the spillway tunnels at tremendous speed, local pressure dropped sharply. Tiny vapor cavities formed and collapsed against the tunnel lining. Cavitation, the same physical process discussed earlier, attacked the concrete with astonishing intensity. When the flood subsided and engineers entered the tunnels, they found craters large enough to swallow heavy equipment. Massive sections of concrete had been torn away. Steel reinforcement was exposed. The tunnels had survived, but only after suffering damage few people imagined possible inside one of the world's largest dams. The event permanently changed how engineers viewed hydraulic structures. It demonstrated that water does not need explosives to destroy concrete. Under the right conditions, physics alone is enough. The lesson from 1983 was not simply that Glen Canyon Dam had been damaged. It was that invisible hydraulic forces could become more important than the visible amount of water passing through the structure. Today, the direction of the danger has reversed. Instead of too much pressure inside the spillways, managers worry about too little hydraulic head inside the reservoir. Instead of protecting the dam from floodwater, they are protecting its ability to continue releasing water during prolonged drought. Yet both situations share the same underlying truth. The greatest risks did not come from the amount of water alone. They came from how water interacted with the infrastructure. In one era, excess energy became destructive. In the other, insufficient energy threatens functionality. Different crises. The same governing physics. History offered another warning decades later when the Colorado River entered one of the driest periods in the modern instrumental record. Beginning around the turn of the 21st century, reservoir levels across the basin began a decline that many initially assumed would be temporary. Dry years had happened before. Wet years would eventually restore storage, or so the expectation went. But year after year, the recovery remained incomplete. A good runoff season would raise Lake Powell noticeably, only to be followed by additional declines. The reservoir no longer behaved like a system recovering from an isolated drought. It behaved like a financial account, experiencing repeated withdrawals that exceeded long-term deposits. Scientists studying tree rings, lake sediments, and historical climate records reached a troubling conclusion. The Colorado River Basin had experienced droughts much longer and more severe than those recorded since modern measurements began. Research using paleoclimate evidence revealed episodes lasting several decades during the medieval period, often called megadroughts. Those ancient droughts occurred long before major dams existed and long before millions of people depended on the river. They demonstrated that the 20th century, during which most of the basin's legal agreements and engineering assumptions were established, had been unusually wet compared with parts of the deeper historical record. This realization changed the way scientists interpreted the modern decline. The concern was no longer simply that another dry cycle had arrived. The concern became whether the system had been designed during an exceptionally favorable climate window that might not represent the longer history of the basin. Then another layer emerged. Rising temperatures began amplifying drought beyond what precipitation alone could explain. Researchers found that warmer air increased evaporation from reservoirs, increased evaporation from soil, lengthened growing seasons, and allowed vegetation to consume more water before it reached streams. Snow still fell in the mountains, but less of that snow became river flow. This process, often described as aridification rather than drought alone, meant that even years with respectable snowfall could produce disappointing runoff into Lake Powell. One of the most influential scientific studies on the basin estimated that human-caused warming had already reduced Colorado River flows by a measurable percentage during the early 21st century, intensifying the effects of naturally occurring dry conditions. The conclusion was carefully framed. Climate change did not create every drought. It did not explain every annual fluctuation, but it increased the likelihood that dry conditions would produce deeper and longer impacts than they once would have. History was no longer only about weather. It had become a story about the interaction between climate and infrastructure. The warning grew more concrete during 2021 and 2022. Lake Powell fell toward elevations that had once been considered unlikely outside hypothetical planning exercises. Federal officials publicly discussed minimum power pool as a realistic operational concern rather than an abstract engineering threshold. Emergency actions followed. Water was released from upstream reservoirs such as Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo Reservoir under the Upper Colorado River Basin's drought response agreements. Additional operational changes altered releases from Lake Powell itself to preserve elevation. These actions were extraordinary because they revealed how interconnected the system had become. A reservoir hundreds of miles away was no longer managed only for its own watershed. It became part of a coordinated effort to protect the functioning of Glen Canyon Dam. The objective was not merely to store more water somewhere in the basin. It was to maintain enough elevation at one specific structure to prevent the loss of hydropower generation and preserve operational flexibility. History had entered the control room. Another important precedent developed quietly inside the dam itself. Engineers recognized that if river outlet works were likely to play a greater role during future droughts, those structures needed additional protection. Inspections had already identified localized cavitation damage after low-elevation operations and high-flow testing. Rather than waiting until dependence on the outlets became unavoidable, the Bureau of Reclamation initiated a project to install new stainless steel liners throughout the 4 outlet tubes. This was not routine cosmetic maintenance. It was preventive adaptation. Engineers were preparing critical infrastructure for operating conditions expected to become more common than they had been during most of the dam's history. The decision itself became historical evidence. Governments rarely invest millions of dollars reinforcing infrastructure against a purely theoretical possibility. They act because operating experience, hydraulic analysis, and future projections together indicate that the risk deserves preparation. Similar lessons appear elsewhere in the American West. Lake Mead, downstream from Lake Powell, also reached historically low elevations during the early 2020 decade, exposing intake structures, requiring new low-level pumping facilities in Las Vegas, and triggering the first official shortage declarations under the Colorado River operating rules. The Southern Nevada Water Authority had already anticipated declining reservoir levels years earlier by constructing a third intake tunnel deep beneath Lake Mead and building a low lake-level pumping station capable of drawing water, even if the lake fell below the older intake systems. That investment became one of the clearest demonstrations of modern water planning. Engineers did not assume the reservoir would always remain high enough for existing infrastructure. They accepted that the infrastructure itself might have to move lower. The same engineering philosophy now shapes discussions around Lake Powell. Instead of asking only how much water will remain, planners increasingly ask whether today's facilities will still function at tomorrow's elevations. The Colorado River Basin has also accumulated a long record of legal precedents that reveal how difficult adaptation becomes once shortages emerge. Compacts, treaties, court rulings, interstate agreements, tribal water settlements, environmental obligations, hydropower commitments, and municipal investments, all developed under assumptions that reservoirs could buffer natural variability. Those agreements succeeded remarkably well for decades because storage created flexibility. But prolonged low reservoir conditions transform flexibility into negotiation. Every acre-foot saved upstream may be needed downstream. Every operational adjustment may benefit one community while increasing uncertainty for another. History therefore teaches another lesson beyond engineering. Water systems do not become fragile only because rivers change. They become fragile because societies build expectations around rivers that no longer behave as they once did. One historical comparison is especially revealing. During the flood emergency of 1983, managers feared they had too much energy inside the reservoir. Their challenge was safely releasing extraordinary pressure without damaging the infrastructure. Today, they face nearly the opposite question. Can enough pressure be preserved to keep the infrastructure performing its intended functions at all? The physical equations governing water have not changed. Gravity remains constant. Hydraulic head follows the same laws it followed when Glen Canyon Dam was completed. What has changed is the operating environment. Snowpack is less reliable as a predictor of runoff. Heat extracts more moisture before rivers can capture it. Long droughts now overlap with record water demand created during the 20th century. Reservoirs designed to smooth temporary fluctuations are increasingly being asked to absorb structural deficits lasting decades. The precedent does not prove that Lake Powell will inevitably reach dead pool. History cannot predict a specific year because future snowfall, conservation, policy, technology, and water use remain uncertain. What history does prove is that thresholds, once dismissed as improbable, have repeatedly entered reality. Cavitation once seemed like an obscure engineering concern until it carved giant holes through spillway tunnels. Minimum power pool once belonged mainly to emergency planning documents until federal managers began taking concrete actions to avoid crossing it. Outlet relining once looked like preventive maintenance until those outlets became central to future operational planning. Each chapter followed the same pattern. The threat first appeared as a technical detail. Then it became an engineering project. Finally, it entered public discussion because the technical detail had become part of everyday risk. That pattern is what makes Lake Powell different today. The falling reservoir is not creating an entirely new problem. It is uncovering problems engineers anticipated years ago, scientists warned about through decades of research, and water managers quietly prepared for before much of the public realized why those preparations mattered. The past does not guarantee disaster. It guarantees something more valuable. It proves that the current warnings are not speculation born from fear. They are the latest chapter in a story that has been unfolding for more than 40 years, written by concrete, steel, snow, heat, and the unchanging force of gravity. The most vulnerable part of the Colorado River system is not necessarily the largest structure, the driest state, or the city with the greatest population. It may be a narrow band of elevation inside Lake Powell, a steel lining inside one outlet tube, an intake pipe fixed to a canyon wall, or a power contract that assumes Glen Canyon Dam will continue producing electricity at a predictable cost. Large systems rarely break everywhere at once. They become brittle at specific points where several forms of dependence have been concentrated into one component. At Lake Powell, that component is the dam's ability to convert stored elevation into controlled flow. If that ability weakens, the consequences do not remain inside the concrete. They travel outward, first through the closest systems, and then through people who may never know which valve, turbine, or water level changed their lives. The first layer of vulnerability sits inside the power plant. Glen Canyon Dam has 8 generating units, but those machines are useful only while the reservoir provides enough hydraulic head to operate them. As the lake falls, the units produce less electricity from the water passing through them. If the surface crosses minimum power pool, the entire power plant loses its normal generating function. The concrete dam remains. The transmission lines remain. The generators remain bolted into place. Yet the energy source that makes them useful has moved below their operating range. This is infrastructure failure without visible destruction. Nothing needs to explode. A reservoir only needs to lose enough height. The immediate effect would be the disappearance of a major source of flexible hydropower from the western electrical system. Glen Canyon is not the largest power station in the region, and its loss would not automatically cause a sweeping blackout. But that comparison misses the function hydropower performs. Electricity demand changes by the minute. It rises when millions of air conditioners switch on during an afternoon heatwave. It shifts when clouds reduce solar output. It can become unstable when a wildfire threatens a transmission corridor, or when another power plant unexpectedly shuts down. Hydroelectric generators can respond quickly because water flow through turbines can be adjusted far faster than many conventional power sources. Glen Canyon, therefore, provides more than it provides timing, control, and the ability to respond. Losing it would remove a balancing tool precisely when the Western grid is being asked to manage hotter summers, larger cooling demand, variable renewable energy, wildfire risk, and expanding electrification. The next vulnerability lies in the institutions that buy and distribute that power. Electricity from the Colorado River Storage Project is marketed through the Western Area Power Administration to utilities, irrigation districts, tribal entities, municipalities, military installations, and other public customers across the West. Many of those customers value federal hydropower because it has historically offered relatively stable, cost-based electricity. When drought reduces generation, contracted electricity must still be delivered or replaced. That replacement power is purchased from the wider market, where prices can rise sharply during the same hot and dry conditions, reducing hydropower production. The mechanism then moves from water elevation to a financial ledger. Less hydraulic head produces fewer megawatt hours. Fewer megawatt hours require more market purchases. Higher purchase costs can place pressure on rates, utility budgets, or the finances of public institutions receiving the power. A school district, rural electric cooperative, tribal utility, or irrigation project may encounter Lake Powell's decline not as an empty reservoir, but as a more expensive electricity bill. The chain is difficult to see because each step occurs in a different institution. Gravity weakens at the dam. A power marketer buys replacement electricity. A local provider adjusts its costs. A household or public agency absorbs the result. The danger grows because hydropower revenue does more than pay for electricity production. Money generated by Colorado River Storage Project Power supports operation and maintenance, repayment obligations, environmental programs, and elements of river management. When generation falls, the system can lose revenue at the same time that drought creates new expenses. More monitoring is required. Outlet works need protection. Replacement energy must be purchased. Environmental interventions may become more complicated. Infrastructure adaptations must be funded. The system therefore faces the financial equivalent of a falling reservoir. Income declines, while emergency costs rise. This does not guarantee insolvency or the end of public power. It means the drought can weaken the very revenue stream used to manage some of its consequences. A second physical weak point lies below the power plant. If the turbines become unavailable, 4 river outlet works must carry the principal burden of moving stored water through Glen Canyon Dam. 4 is not a large number when they become the only major gravity-fed pathways between one of the nation's largest reservoirs and the river below. Each outlet is substantial, but the system's vulnerability comes from concentration. With 8 turbine penstocks functioning, an individual unit can be removed for maintenance, while other pathways continue operating. Below minimum power pool, losing one of 4 outlet works would remove roughly 1/4 of the primary release routes available at that elevation, although actual capacity would depend on conditions and operating limits. A valve problem, damaged liner, inspection requirement, vibration concern, or repair would no longer be a local maintenance issue. It could become a basin-wide operational constraint. The weakest point might be only a few feet of steel, but the consequences could reach hundreds of miles downstream. The Bureau of Reclamation's decision to reline all 4 outlets shows that this vulnerability is being treated seriously. The work is designed to preserve efficient and reliable releases, not because failure is certain, but because future operation may place greater importance on structures that once served a more limited bypass role. This is the logic of adaptation before crisis. Yet the need for adaptation also exposes the underlying fragility. A water system serving vast regions may eventually depend on 4 tubes embedded in one dam, and those tubes depend on a reservoir remaining high enough for gravity to push water through them. The third weak point is a comparatively small water intake serving Page, Arizona, and the Lachey chapter of the Navajo Nation. As Lake Powell declined, the original intake arrangement faced the possibility of losing access to the reservoir. Reclamation crews completed a lower connection intended to preserve deliveries even if the lake approaches dead pool. The project protected an essential supply, but it also revealed the basic problem. Water infrastructure is built at a particular height. When the water moves below that height, a community can face shortage even while a vast body of water remains nearby. The lower connection allows these communities to reach deeper, but engineering alone does not erase every risk. Low water can affect pumping requirements, water quality, sediment conditions, maintenance, and the reliability of equipment working near the limits of the reservoir. Page stands beside Lake Powell, yet proximity does not guarantee security. Lachey lies within a region where many Navajo households have historically faced inadequate water infrastructure, making dependable local delivery especially significant. The mechanism passes directly through people. The mountain produces less runoff. The lake falls below an older intake. Engineers extend the system downward, and the continued operation of that connection determines whether treated water reaches homes, clinics, schools, and businesses. The fourth vulnerability is the river immediately below the dam. Glen Canyon Dam has transformed the Colorado River into a regulated system in which the timing, temperature, and volume of releases shape the Grand Canyon ecosystem. Native fish, invasive species, aquatic insects, sediment, beaches, vegetation, and recreational use. all respond differently to changes in dam operations. At low reservoir elevations, warmer water can reach the intakes, altering downstream temperatures. Reduced operating flexibility can limit the ability to produce specialized flows designed to rebuild sandbars or support ecological objectives. Using the outlet works instead of the turbines may change both power production and the characteristics of releases. Managers are therefore not choosing between water for people and water for nature in two separate systems. They are operating one flow that simultaneously affects hydropower, legal deliveries, fish habitat, river recreation, archaeological resources, and the physical shape of beaches through the Grand Canyon. A decision that protects one function can impose costs on another. The smaller the operational margin becomes, the fewer compromises can be avoided. The fifth layer of vulnerability lies downstream at Lake Mead. Water passing through Glen Canyon Dam becomes part of the supply entering the lower basin's largest reservoir. If releases from Powell must be reduced to protect its elevation, Mead receives less water. If releases are increased to support Mead, Powell falls faster. The two reservoirs act like connected emergency accounts, but transferring water from one does not create new supply. It moves protection from one location to another. This places cities, agricultural districts, tribal nations, and Mexico inside the same balancing problem. Arizona, Nevada, California, and northwestern Mexico rely on lower basin deliveries, while Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming depend on the upper basin's ability to develop and manage their share without violating interstate obligations. The legal architecture assumes water can be measured, stored, and released. At very low elevations, the physical architecture may no longer offer the flexibility that the legal architecture requires. The sixth and most human vulnerability appears in agriculture. Farms consume most of the water diverted from the Colorado River system, but that statement can conceal the people and supply chains inside the number. Irrigation supports cattle feed, vegetables, orchards, tribal farms, rural employment, food processing businesses, and communities built around canals. When water deliveries tighten, the effect does not stop at the edge of a field. Less water can mean fewer planted acres. Fewer acres can mean lower farm income. Lower income can reduce local employment and spending. Feed shortages can raise costs for livestock producers. Food production may shift to other regions where water, land, labor, or climate creates different risks. The mechanism moves from reservoir elevation into an irrigation allocation, from the allocation into a planting decision, from the field into a paycheck, and from that paycheck into a household meal. The vulnerability is not distributed equally. A large municipality may have multiple sources, stored reserves, legal teams, conservation programs, and the borrowing capacity to build new infrastructure. A small rural system may depend on one well, one intake, or one canal. Wealthier households can absorb higher power and water rates more easily than low-income families. Established water users may hold stronger legal rights than rapidly growing communities or tribes still awaiting the infrastructure needed to use recognized allocations. A shortage measured as 1% across the basin can become a much larger hardship for those with the fewest alternatives. This is why the headline storage number does not describe the real danger. 22% full sounds like one condition shared by everyone. In reality, it produces a hierarchy of exposure. Recreation businesses feel shoreline changes early. Dam operators confront declining pressure. Power customers face reduced generation and replacement costs. Page and Lachey depend on a lower intake. River ecosystems experience altered flow and temperature. Agricultural users confront uncertainty about future deliveries. Smaller utilities and disadvantaged communities face costs they may have less capacity to absorb. The reservoir level is uniform. The consequences are not. The system becomes most dangerous where dependence is high and redundancy is low. One turbine can be backed by another until all 8 lose usable head. One outlet can be repaired until only 4 outlets carry the river. One city intake can be lowered But not every community can finance a new pipeline or pumping station. One wet winter can provide relief, but it cannot restore every depleted reserve or redesign every vulnerable structure. Lake Powell's decline is therefore more serious than its headline number because the disappearing water is taking options with it. Each lost foot removes not only storage but also pressure, power, flexibility, revenue, ecological choices, and time. The small part capable of breaking the larger system is not a single dramatic crack in Glen Canyon Dam. It is the shrinking space in which operators still have more than one acceptable decision. When that space disappears, the system may continue moving water, but every remaining pathway becomes more expensive, more contested, and more essential. Lake Powell is often treated as a local emergency in a remote desert, but the falling water is revealing something much larger than the condition of one reservoir. It is exposing a mismatch between the climate now feeding the Colorado River and the system built to control it. That system was designed during the 20th century around a river that appeared variable but ultimately dependable, a river whose wet years could refill reservoirs after dry years, whose mountain snowpack could be translated into predictable runoff, and whose enormous dams could hold enough water to protect cities and farms from temporary drought. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were the center of that strategy. Together, they acted as giant shock absorbers between an uncertain climate and a society demanding certainty. When snowfall was weak, stored water could be released. When runoff was strong, the reservoirs could recover, shortages could be delayed, negotiations could continue, and the river could be made to appear more stable than nature intended. But a shock absorber works only while it retains room to compress. As storage declines, each new dry year reaches the people and infrastructure behind the reservoir more quickly. Lake Powell is now losing not only water, but also its ability to isolate the wider system from climate variability. The falling surface is shortening the distance between a poor snow season in the Rocky Mountains and a difficult decision in an irrigation district, a tribal community, a power agency, or a state capital. This is what transforms low storage into systemic risk. A reservoir crisis becomes a governance crisis when there is no longer enough stored water to postpone disagreement. It becomes an infrastructure crisis when the remaining water falls below the elevations required by intakes, turbines, and outlets. It becomes an economic crisis when power production falls, replacement energy becomes more expensive, and agricultural communities face uncertainty about future deliveries. It becomes an ecological crisis when managers lose the flexibility to shape flows, temperatures, and sediment conditions downstream. These are not separate emergencies occurring beside one another. They are different expressions of the same shrinking margin. The larger pattern begins in the atmosphere. The Colorado River is primarily supplied by snow falling at gong, 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 gong. The Colorado River is primarily supplied. Planners treated snowpack as a kind of seasonal deposit. Snow accumulated during winter remained stored in the mountains and melted during spring and early summer, producing the runoff that filled reservoirs and supplied the basin through the hot season. That relationship still exists, but it is becoming less efficient. Rising temperatures cause more precipitation to fall as rain, rather than snow at some elevations. Snow begins melting earlier. The ground can be warmer and drier when meltwater arrives. Vegetation can remain active longer and consume more moisture. The atmosphere can draw more water from soil, plants, and open reservoir surfaces. The result is that an apparently respectable snowpack can produce less streamflow than managers once expected. The water is not vanishing through one dramatic process. It is being intercepted along the entire route from sky to river. Some returns to the atmosphere before reaching a channel. Some replenishes dry soil. Some is consumed by plants. Some arrives earlier than storage, and demand systems were designed to use it. The runoff efficiency of the basin declines, and Lake Powell receives the final result. This is why the word drought is no longer sufficient by itself. A drought is usually understood as a temporary departure from normal conditions. It begins, becomes severe, and eventually ends when precipitation returns. Aridification describes something more structural, a transition toward a persistently drier baseline in which the old definition of normal becomes less useful. Under aridification, a wet year can still occur. Snow can still accumulate deeply, rivers can still rise, reservoirs can still gain dozens of feet, but the background system remains warmer, evaporation remains stronger, soils may remain thirstier, and a larger share of each wet year may be consumed before it becomes durable storage. Relief still arrives. Recovery becomes harder. This distinction changes everything about planning. A system responding to drought waits for normal conditions to return. A system responding to aridification must consider that the previous normal may not return with the same frequency or the same water yield. Lake Powell sits directly between those two philosophies. Many of the institutions governing it were designed to manage drought. The emerging physical reality increasingly resembles aridification. The result is a dangerous delay between what the river is becoming and what the rules still expect it to be. The operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead have relied heavily on reservoir elevations because elevations provide visible triggers for releases, shortages, and coordinated actions. But elevation-based rules cannot create water. They can only decide where scarcity appears and when. Holding more water in Lake Powell may protect hydropower and gravity flow at Glen Canyon Dam, but it can reduce the amount arriving at Lake Mead. Releasing more water toward Mead may support lower basin storage, while moving Powell closer to minimum power pool. Cutting deliveries can preserve reservoir elevation, while shifting economic and social damage toward water users. Releasing stored water can postpone shortages while consuming the reserve needed for the next dry year. Every option protects one part of the system by transferring pressure to another, as long as both reservoirs hold large buffers. These transfers can be managed gradually. When both are low, the system begins to resemble two patients sharing one oxygen tank. Increasing the flow to one does not increase the total supply. It only changes which risk becomes immediate. That is why the post-2026 operating debate matters far beyond legal language. Federal officials, basin states, tribes, agricultural users, cities, power customers, conservation groups, and Mexico are not merely negotiating percentages. They are attempting to design rules for a river whose future supply contains deeper uncertainty than the rules governing the past. The new framework must somehow balance reservoir protection, legal obligations, human needs, ecological damage, hydropower, tribal rights, and the possibility of flows lower than those experienced during the period when the existing system was built. No operating formula can eliminate that conflict. A formula can only determine how the conflict is distributed. The system can become overloaded before any single reservoir reaches dead pool because every institution begins using the same shrinking buffer to solve a different problem. Upper basin states may seek protection against releasing water they believe was never physically available. Lower basin users may seek dependable deliveries supported by decades of investment and established law. Tribal nations may demand access to water recognized in principle, but often denied in infrastructure and practice. Farmers may argue that sudden reductions threaten food production and rural economies. Cities may point to conservation already achieved while preparing for continued population growth. Environmental managers may warn that reducing flows below the dam could intensify ecological damage already created by regulation and warming. Power agencies may need enough elevation to preserve generation and revenue. Dam engineers may need enough hydraulic head to maintain release capacity. Each argument can be valid. The overload comes from asking one river to satisfy all of them under a declining supply. This is the new baseline taking shape around Lake Powell. It is not simply a permanently low water level, and it does not mean the reservoir will decline every year without interruption. The new baseline is a condition in which recovery cannot be assumed. Wet years must repair deeper deficits, and every major operating decision must consider infrastructure thresholds once treated as remote. A strong snow year may raise the lake dramatically, but managers can no longer assume that the rise marks the return of the old system. The following winter may be dry. High temperatures may reduce runoff efficiency. Demands may remain above long-term supply. The reservoir may descend again before institutions have used the temporary relief to make structural changes. Under the old baseline, a wet year restored confidence. Under the emerging baseline, a wet year purchases time. What is done with that time becomes more important than the rise itself. The danger is that temporary recovery can encourage temporary thinking. Reopened boat ramps, stronger hydropower generation, and higher reservoir levels can make the emergency appear solved. Political pressure for difficult conservation measures can weaken. Negotiations can slow. Investments can be delayed. Then another poor runoff year arrives, and the system returns to the edge with fewer options than before. The reservoir becomes a pendulum swinging between alarm and relief, while the long-term center of gravity continues moving downward. A resilient response would treat every wet year not as proof that the crisis ended, but as an opportunity to rebuild margin. That could mean reducing consumptive use, improving measurement, modernizing irrigation where savings are real and protected, changing landscaping and urban demand, securing tribal water infrastructure, reinforcing outlet works, planning lower intake systems, adjusting power arrangements, and developing operating rules that remain functional across a wider range of hydrology. None of these measures can manufacture a river larger than the climate provides. Their purpose is to reduce the number of human systems that fail when the river becomes smaller. The deeper lesson extends beyond the Colorado Basin. Much of modern society was built by converting stable historical patterns into engineering assumptions. Dams were sized around past floods and flows. Storm drains were built around rainfall statistics. Power grids were designed around familiar temperature ranges. Farms were organized around planting calendars and water deliveries. Insurance systems estimated risk from previous disasters. But when the baseline moves, infrastructure can remain physically intact while becoming statistically obsolete. Lake Powell is one of the clearest examples because the change is visible on the canyon walls. The white ring marks the elevation at which the 20th century system expected water to stand. The shrinking blue surface marks the range in which the 21st century system must operate. Between them lies a missing reservoir of confidence. The central question is no longer whether engineers can keep Glen Canyon Dam functioning during one severe drought. The question is whether the entire network of law, infrastructure, energy, agriculture, ecology, and public expectations can adapt to a river that may repeatedly approach the dam's lowest operating thresholds. Lake Powell is not only storing water, it is storing time for that adaptation. As the lake falls, the time falls with it. When a crisis grows large enough, it begins attracting explanations that are too simple, too absolute, or too emotionally satisfying. Lake Powell is no exception. Every declining reservoir invites dramatic headlines, confident predictions, and arguments that reduce an extraordinarily complex river system to a single cause or a single solution. But if this story is going to remain scientifically honest, it must separate what is supported by evidence from what is merely repeated because it sounds convincing. The first distinction concerns climate and drought. It is accurate to say that rising temperatures have intensified stress across the Colorado River Basin. Warmer air increases evaporation, dries soils more rapidly, lengthens the growing season for vegetation, and reduces the fraction of snowmelt that ultimately becomes river flow. Multiple scientific studies support that conclusion. It is also accurate to say that the basin has experienced one of the driest multi-decade periods in the modern observational record, with paleoclimate evidence indicating that the early 21st century ranks among the most severe drought periods in at least 12 centuries. But it is not scientifically accurate to claim that every single year of low runoff is caused entirely by climate change. Weather still matters, natural variability still matters, atmospheric circulation still matters. El Niño, La Niña, winter storm tracks, snowpack distribution, spring temperatures, and summer monsoon patterns all influence annual runoff. Climate change shifts the background conditions under which those natural variations occur. It does not erase them. The second misconception concerns snowfall. Many people assume that one snowy winter automatically solves the reservoir crisis. Others believe that once a reservoir falls this low, no amount of snow can ever matter again. Both positions ignore how the Colorado River actually functions. A very wet winter can produce a remarkable rise in Lake Powell. The extraordinary snowpack during the winter preceding the 2023 runoff season raised reservoir elevations significantly and temporarily reduced immediate operational danger. That improvement was real. It was measurable. It demonstrated that the basin still responds to strong runoff years. But the opposite conclusion is equally important. One exceptional winter does not erase more than 2 decades of accumulated storage loss. Reservoirs recover through repeated years in which inflow consistently exceeds releases, evaporation, and system demands. A single good year can interrupt decline without restoring the long-term balance between supply and use. Hope based on one winter is no more scientific than despair based on one dry season. The third misunderstanding concerns water consumption. It is common to hear that cities are the primary reason Lake Powell is declining because large metropolitan areas have expanded dramatically during the past several decades. Urban growth certainly increases demand and requires careful planning. Municipal conservation remains an important part of future adaptation. Yet cities account for only part of the basin's consumptive use. Agriculture remains the largest water user across the Colorado River system. That statement is factual, but it too can become misleading if presented carelessly. Farms are not wasting water simply because they consume more than cities. Agriculture produces food, livestock feed, employment, and economic activity that depend on irrigation in an arid region. The real challenge is not identifying one villain. It is balancing competing demands that were developed under assumptions about river flow that are becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Blaming only cities ignores agriculture. Blaming only agriculture ignores municipal growth, industrial demand, tribal rights, environmental obligations, and legal commitments. The river is under pressure because multiple demands converge on a supply that has become less reliable. The fourth misconception involves the Colorado River Compact itself. Popular discussion often claims that the river was divided using wildly unrealistic flow estimates, and that every modern problem follows directly from that original mistake. The historical record is more complicated. Early 20th century negotiators relied on the best streamflow observations available at the time, although those measurements happened to coincide with an unusually wet period compared with the longer paleoclimate record. The compact also reflected political compromise, incomplete scientific knowledge, and assumptions about future development that seemed reasonable under the information then available. That does not mean the compact is perfectly suited to present conditions. Many experts argue that modern operating rules must account for lower, long-term flows. But presenting the compact as nothing more than an obvious mathematical blunder ignores the scientific and political context in which it was created. Understanding history requires more than identifying one incorrect number. It requires understanding how limited information, institutional priorities, and engineering optimism shaped the system that exists today. Another claim often repeated online is that Lake Powell will inevitably become completely dry within a specific number of years. Such statements usually circulate with precise dates, dramatic graphics, or alarming certainty. The available evidence does not support that level of confidence. Future reservoir elevations depend on many interacting variables, including annual snowfall, runoff efficiency, water demand, interstate agreements, conservation efforts, reservoir operations, tribal settlements, environmental policies, and future climate conditions. Scientists can model plausible scenarios, estimate probabilities, and identify thresholds of concern. They cannot predict the exact elevation of Lake Powell several years in advance with certainty. Forecasts change because the atmosphere changes. Hydrologic systems are dynamic. Responsible science presents ranges of possible outcomes rather than guaranteed futures. The opposite misconception also deserves attention. Some observers point to recent improvements in reservoir levels and conclude that concerns about minimum power pool or gravity flow have been exaggerated. That conclusion ignores the difference between temporary relief and structural recovery. A reservoir may gain 50 feet after a strong runoff season and still remain historically low. Hydropower may continue operating while the long-term trend continues to reduce operating margin. Emergency actions taken during wet years may postpone critical thresholds without eliminating them. The absence of immediate failure is not evidence that previous warnings were false. Engineers install backup systems precisely because they hope emergencies never become visible to the public. When preventive actions succeed, it can appear as though the original concern was unnecessary, even though the successful intervention is the reason the worst outcome did not occur. This misunderstanding appears frequently whenever major infrastructure survives a predicted risk. If a hurricane changes course after widespread evacuations, some people conclude the warnings were exaggerated rather than recognizing that uncertainty was part of the forecast. The same logic applies to Lake Powell. Preparedness should not be mistaken for overreaction. Another important distinction involves Glen Canyon Dam itself. There is no credible evidence that the dam is approaching structural collapse because reservoir levels are low. Modern engineering inspections, maintenance programs, and operational planning continue to monitor the structure closely. The concerns discussed throughout this documentary involve operational thresholds, hydraulic performance, outlet reliability, power generation, and water delivery. These are serious issues with regional consequences, but they are fundamentally different from claims that the dam is about to fail catastrophically. Confusing operational vulnerability with structural instability creates unnecessary fear while distracting attention from the genuine risks that deserve public understanding. The scientifically supported concern is that infrastructure can lose function before it loses integrity. A turbine can stop generating electricity while remaining mechanically sound. An intake can become unusable because the water falls below it, even though the pipe itself remains intact. An outlet can require careful operation because of cavitation risk, while still performing safely within established limits. Function and structural survival are not the same thing. The documentary's central argument depends on maintaining that distinction. There is also a temptation to assign responsibility to a single institution. Some blame federal agencies. Others blame Western states, environmental regulations, urban development, agriculture, tribal water settlements, or international obligations with Mexico. Reality is less satisfying because responsibility is distributed across generations. Engineers built reservoirs using the knowledge available at the time. Lawmakers established agreements intended to reduce conflict. Farmers developed irrigation systems that transformed deserts into productive landscapes. Cities expanded because reservoirs appeared capable of supporting growth. Scientific understanding improved over time. Climate conditions changed. Population increased. None of these developments alone explains the current situation. Together they produced a system that now faces conditions outside many of its original assumptions. Complexity is not an excuse for avoiding accountability. It is a reminder that meaningful solutions rarely emerge from identifying one convenient culprit. Perhaps the most important distinction concerns the word crisis itself. A crisis is often imagined as a sudden event, a flood overtopping a levee, an earthquake collapsing a bridge, or a wildfire consuming a town. Lake Powell represents a different category of crisis. It advances gradually. The reservoir can decline a few feet each month without attracting widespread attention. Engineers can make operational adjustments. States can negotiate temporary agreements. New intake systems can be constructed. Outlet works can be relined. Hydropower generation can continue at reduced capacity. Every individual adaptation can appear successful, yet together they reveal something deeper. They reveal that the system is spending increasing amounts of money, engineering effort, political negotiation, and operational complexity simply to preserve functions that once occurred naturally because the reservoir stood higher. This is not evidence that adaptation is failing. It is evidence that adaptation has become a permanent feature of management rather than an occasional emergency response. That distinction matters because it shapes how society interprets success. Success is no longer returning to the conditions of the late 20th century. Success increasingly means maintaining reliable water delivery, ecological protection, electrical stability, and interstate cooperation under conditions that may never again resemble the historical average. The greatest misunderstanding would therefore be to frame Lake Powell as either a hopeless disaster or a temporary inconvenience. The evidence supports neither conclusion. The reservoir is not doomed to inevitable collapse regardless of future action, nor is it safely returning to historical norms because of one favorable runoff season. The truth lies between those extremes. Climate science indicates that the basin is becoming warmer. Hydrology indicates that warmer conditions reduce runoff efficiency. Engineering analysis indicates that lower elevations reduce hydraulic head and operational flexibility. Water management demonstrates that conservation, infrastructure improvements, and coordinated operations can reduce risk. None of these statements contradicts the others. Together they describe a future defined not by certainty, but by narrowing margins. That is the real lesson hidden beneath the debates, headlines, and political arguments. The greatest threat facing Lake Powell is not misinformation itself. It is the tendency to replace a complicated reality with explanations that feel emotionally complete long before the science actually is. The story began with a pale white ring wrapped around the sandstone walls of Lake Powell. At first glance, it looked like a scar left behind by disappearing water. By the end of this journey, it has become something else. It is a measurement of shrinking margin. Every foot of exposed rock represents more than water that once filled the canyon. It represents hydraulic head, no longer available to spin turbines, operating flexibility, no longer available to engineers, negotiating space no longer available to water managers, and time no longer available to postpone difficult decisions. The reservoir has become a visible record of invisible systems, gradually surrendering the advantages they once took for granted. That is why Lake Powell matters even to people who may never visit Arizona or Utah. This is not simply the story of a desert reservoir. It is the story of what happens when infrastructure designed around historical stability enters a climate that no longer guarantees the same stability. Throughout this documentary, the question has never been whether the lake still contains water. It clearly does. The question has been whether the remaining water can continue performing every job society expects it to perform. Can it generate electricity, regulate river flows, satisfy legal agreements, support agriculture, protect ecosystems, sustain tribal communities, provide municipal supplies, and preserve enough elevation to repeat the same cycle the following year? For decades, the answer was usually yes. Today, the answer is becoming increasingly conditional. It depends on snowfall. It depends on temperature. It depends on evaporation. It depends on conservation. It depends on interstate cooperation. It depends on engineering adaptation. Most of all, it depends on maintaining enough height for gravity to continue doing the work that no human technology has ever replaced on the same scale. Gravity has always been the quiet partner in the Colorado River system. It never appeared in legal negotiations. It never signed interstate compacts. It never attended public hearings. Yet every gallon stored behind Glen Canyon Dam has relied on gravity to become useful. Gravity transformed mountain snow into river flow. Gravity created hydraulic pressure. Gravity turned turbines. Gravity delivered water downstream. Every legal agreement, irrigation project, hydroelectric contract, and municipal pipeline assumed that gravity would continue receiving enough elevation to perform those tasks. The falling reservoir reveals the hidden contract beneath all the others. The real agreement was never only between states, it was between engineering and physics. That agreement cannot be renegotiated. It can only be respected. The lesson reaches far beyond one dam. Across the world, Societies are discovering that infrastructure rarely fails because concrete suddenly becomes weak. It fails because the conditions surrounding that concrete gradually change until the original design assumptions no longer hold. Seawalls built for 20th century tides face higher oceans. Stormwater systems designed for familiar rainfall intensities encounter storms delivering more water in less time. Electrical grids constructed around historical temperature ranges must supply record-breaking cooling demand while protecting equipment exposed to unprecedented heat. Forest management developed under one climate now confronts longer fire seasons and drier vegetation. Lake Powell belongs to that larger family of challenges. The reservoir itself is not the anomaly. It is one example of a broader transition in which natural systems are moving faster than many of the structures built to manage them. Yet, there is an equally important lesson hidden within the engineering response. People often imagine adaptation as an admission of defeat. The history of Glen Canyon Dam suggests something different. Engineers reinforced spillways after cavitation damage. Water managers coordinated emergency releases from upstream reservoirs. Communities constructed lower intake systems. Federal agencies invested in relining the river outlet works before they became even more essential. Scientists improved runoff forecasting by incorporating new climate understanding. States and tribes entered increasingly complex negotiations over future operations. None of these actions eliminated the problem, but each one expanded the range of possible responses. Adaptation does not guarantee success. It creates opportunities that would not exist without preparation. That distinction matters because the future of the Colorado River will almost certainly involve more adaptation, not less. Waiting for the river to return permanently to 20th century behavior is not a strategy. Building institutions capable of functioning across a wider range of river conditions is. The challenge is not simply technical, it is philosophical. Modern civilization has become extraordinarily effective at converting uncertainty into dependable services. Reservoirs smooth rainfall. Electrical grids balance fluctuating demand. Highways shorten distance. Supply chains compress geography. Most of the time, these systems become so reliable that people stop noticing them. Water comes from a faucet. Electricity arrives with the flip of a switch. Food appears on store shelves. The machinery linking mountain snow to daily life becomes almost invisible. Lake Powell interrupts that illusion. It reminds us that reliability is not a natural condition. It is something maintained continuously by infrastructure, institutions, maintenance crews, engineers, scientists, operators, and the physical laws governing the natural world. When one of those foundations changes, reliability must be rebuilt rather than assumed. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Colorado River is not that it is under stress. Rivers have always experienced floods, droughts, and change. The remarkable part is how many millions of people have learned to depend on every stage of its journey. Snow falling on distant mountains influences electricity generated hundreds of miles away. Reservoir elevation affects agricultural decisions across multiple states. Outlet conditions inside one dam influence ecological management through the Grand Canyon. A lower intake pipe protects drinking water for nearby communities. A negotiation between state governments shapes the confidence of investors, utilities, farmers, and families. Few systems demonstrate interconnectedness more clearly. That interconnectedness can become a source of vulnerability, but it can also become a source of resilience. Knowledge gained by scientists informs engineers. Engineering improvements provide new options for water managers. Conservation in one sector creates flexibility in another. Tribal participation strengthens basin-wide planning. Better forecasting improves reservoir operations. Every successful response depends on recognizing that no single institution controls the river alone. The future will almost certainly include difficult years. Some winters will disappoint. Some runoff seasons will exceed expectations. Reservoirs will rise and fall. Political disagreements will continue. New scientific discoveries will refine present understanding. Engineering projects not yet imagined today may eventually become routine. None of those developments changes the central reality revealed by Lake Powell. Water management in the 21st century can no longer focus only on the quantity of water stored. It must also protect the functionality of the systems that move, measure, deliver, and depend upon that water. The reservoir is valuable, not only because of the billions of gallons it contains, but because of the elevation those gallons occupy. The greatest misconception about Lake Powell has always been that the crisis begins when the lake runs out of water. The evidence tells a different story. The crisis begins when the remaining water can no longer perform the roles assigned to it. That threshold arrives earlier, more quietly, and with fewer dramatic images than most people expect. A reservoir may still appear immense from the air, while losing the hydraulic advantage that made it useful. A dam may remain structurally sound, while operating inside a shrinking range of acceptable conditions. A river may continue flowing, while every release demands more calculation than the one before it. These are not signs of imminent collapse. They are signs of a system approaching the limits of assumptions that once seemed permanent. And perhaps that is the most enduring image to carry away from Lake Powell. Not an empty canyon, not a cracked lakebed, not a collapsing dam. Instead, a vast body of blue water resting beneath an even larger white ring, separated by only a few hundred feet of exposed stone that now tells the story of decades. Every layer of that canyon wall marks a decision, a winter, a runoff season, a negotiation, a scientific discovery, or a missed opportunity. It is a geological timeline, painted by water levels instead of sediment. The white ring is no longer merely evidence of loss. It is evidence that the operating space between abundance and constraint can disappear gradually enough for an entire generation to mistake the transition for normal life. One day, another generation may stand on the shore of Lake Powell and see a very different waterline. It may be higher because cooperation, conservation, engineering, and favorable climate restored part of the reservoir's margin. It may be lower because warming continued, runoff weakened further, and adaptation could not keep pace. No one can state that future with certainty. Science does not promise certainty where uncertainty genuinely exists, but science does reveal the direction of the pressures acting upon the system, and engineering reveals the thresholds that cannot be negotiated once they are crossed. The future, therefore, depends less on predicting one exact water level than on deciding how much margin society chooses to rebuild before the next difficult year arrives. This reservoir crisis will eventually pass into history, just as every flood, drought, and engineering challenge before it has. But what it has already revealed will remain. The systems used to forecast, store, distribute, generate, and recover were built for a world whose patterns are changing. The greatest question is no longer whether humanity can build larger dams or longer pipelines. The question is whether it can redesign its expectations as successfully as it once redesigned its rivers. Long after today's water level has changed, that question will still be waiting along the sandstone walls of Lake Powell, where gravity continues to measure every decision 1 foot at a time.